Welcome to Studio 21. For the next minutes, we'll be talking about the Civil War, specifically the period just leading up to the Civil War and at the beginning of it. Our guest is Associate Professor Ken Blankemeyer, who has been a spearhead and a chair for our Sesquicentennial observations through Tulsa Community College. Ken, thank you for your time. I
Glad to be here.
That. Let's talk about that period right before the Civil War. America is less than 100 years old. How did people in America view themselves, both North and South?
They viewed themselves as citizens of a state, not of citizens of the United States first. And so even in the North, you considered yourself a New Yorker or Ohioan first, and then part of the United States. And as history moved towards the time of the Civil War, this became even more amplified, driven mostly by economics.
Let's talk about that economics. The South, we're told, had primarily an agrarian society?
That's true. The North had started to industrialize. The South, sort of as a mirror image, did the same thing with cotton. Between 1820 and 1860, the amount of cotton planted in the South was increased tremendously. And this made the South fairly wealthy. At the same time, the North was fairly wealthy because of the industrialization. The difference was, it was in the South, it was a monoculture. It was all cotton. And this increase in the value of cotton and the wealth of the South really was one of the things that started to drive these sections apart. Because with cotton, you have a very labor-intensive crop. And the labor was, of course, the slaves. So before 1820, slavery was not defended as vigorously as it was after that because it wasn't as economically valuable. But as the value of cotton increased, the need for new land increased, and the South wanted to move west with slavery. The North did not want them to do that.
And so are you talking about primarily two different economic systems that are working here?
Mm-hmm. Of course, the North started to industrialize and was one of the most industrialized areas in the world by the time of the Civil War. However, that doesn't mean it was heavily industrialized. Still, 75% of the people lived on farms, but 25% about lived in cities and were part of this economic system that the Industrial Revolution developed. And so even though most of the people in the North were still farmers, they weren't so much what was called subsistence farming. And that doesn't mean they just got by, but it means that you pretty much grow everything you need, produce it on the farm, have a little bit of leftover to buy other things. By this time, the transportation system, starting with steamboats, and eventually the railroads, developed to the point where you could have cash crop farming. So a lot of these farms grew. Not only did they produce some of the stuff that they were going to use themselves, but they produced a cash crop which they could actually get somewhere to sell. Before this, it was rather hard to do.
Did the North need the South and vice versa?
The South needed the North more than the North needed the South. However, if you look at and we have a graphic of a map before the Civil War, especially in the West, which included Ohio and things west of that. It didn't include Oklahoma and Texas at the time. But the West was heavily dependent on the South because the transportation system, as defined by the Mississippi River system, went right through New Orleans. And so New Orleans was one of the major cities in the United States at the time because of all this trade coming down the Mississippi River. Now, at the time of the Civil War, things were starting to switch towards railroads, but there was still this heavy dependence on the transportation system that went through the South. The South depended on the North, or at least foreign countries, for almost everything. They didn't, even though they produced all this cotton, they didn't have many mills in the South. They didn't have many manufacturing industries in the South, and so almost everything that you would buy would come from the North or a foreign country like England or France.
Let's talk a little bit about how the South, did Southerners like Yankees before the Civil War?
No. And Yankees didn't like Southerners. But now, when you say that, there wasn't the animosity that developed after the Civil War. But we can see the tension between the North and the South all the way back to the founding of the country. George Washington allegedly was irritated with Yankee arrogance, meaning people in Massachusetts. But the fissure that divided the North and the South deepened greatly as these economic tensions increased from the time of the Revolution.
Now, there was a whole bunch of efforts to try to keep things together. Before
There were.
the civil, we had the Missouri Compromise. Henry Clay was very involved.
Right.
Then there was a man named Crittenden who was thought of as a potential presidential candidate for a long time.
He actually did run, but and one of his sons was a general for the Confederates, and one of his sons was a general for the Union.
Now, that was about the last hope to keep this country together before war, wasn't
There
it?
was
His
a
efforts?
there was a peace conference after Lincoln was elected in the fall of 1860, and the reason was the South was threatening to secede, and in fact, South Carolina was the first to secede in December of 1860. In order to sort of patch things together, a peace compromise was attempted. It didn't make it. One of the problems was the great compromisers, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, even John C. Calhoun, were dead by this time. And there were also, the tensions were stronger. As I pointed out, cotton became more and more lucrative, and as it did, this emphasized the economic divisions between these sections. And so even if those compromisers had been alive, let's say in 1860, it's really questionable whether they could have held things together, and if they did, it's my opinion that eventually things would have had to come to a head.
Was there any strong Union support in the South? We hear about the border states and things like that.
Yeah, there was. In the border states, which are generally defined as Delaware, which really doesn't count because there weren't many slaves there, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, there was a lot of Union support in those areas, but there was also Confederate support as well. Now,
Was that all based on economics then? Because they didn't really need that's the economy of a slave culture?
these border states and even the Upper South were not cotton states. There might have been a little cotton grown in them, but not much. But they were slave states. But Kentucky was a slave exporter. Let's just talk about Kentucky, which, by the way, during the Civil War, 2/3 of the people from Kentucky who fought in the Civil War fought for the Union. 1/3 fought for the South. So there's a border state that was very heavily Union in its sympathy.
And that's where Senator Crittenden was from, too.
Right. And Kentucky was, Kentucky was right in the middle of things. Let's put it that way. And it was a key because we talked about this river transportation system. It runs all along the northern border of Kentucky, the Ohio River, and then the Mississippi River does run on the western border of Kentucky. So if Kentucky went Confederate, this would, as Lincoln said, probably be the game because there would be no way that the Union could possibly deal with that. But the South made a great mistake with Kentucky. There was this divided loyalty in Kentucky, and so Kentucky actually declared itself neutral at the early part of the Civil War. And if the South had respected that, there was no way that the Union could get by Kentucky. If the Union was going to invade the South and the West, it would have to come through Kentucky. So if the South had just left them alone, this would have been a very difficult situation for the Union Army.
It could have neutralized like the Ohio River, which was like the superhighway with the Mississippi of that
More
era.
important than that were the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers, which ran through Kentucky into Tennessee. The Union could not touch that unless they wanted Kentucky to go Confederate. What happened was the Confederates invaded Kentucky to secure what they considered to be a important part of the coast of the Mississippi River to defend the lower Mississippi. Now, if they hadn't done that, the Union couldn't have moved down that way, and they certainly couldn't have moved through Kentucky to Tennessee. But a political general in the South named Leonidas K. Polk, who did go to West Point, but he never was commissioned in the Union Army, decided to invade Kentucky, and he did, and this is the beginning of the end, really. It took 4 years, but it was a tremendous error on the part of the South.
This is a little bit of a tangent. We hadn't talked about this ahead of time, but you just talked about a tactical military mistake, which raises the question, as we start the Civil War, as the Confederate States of America become a nation, how much central authority is there? How much dictating of military policy is there?